All right, I've got quite a story to tell, and it involves me and my wife, Jennifer. We've been together for 9 years, the classic high school sweethearts. Our love story began in high school after a somewhat cheesy school dance, one of those events everyone was pretty much required to attend. People always saw us as the perfect couple, but we had different dreams for our future. I aimed to dive into my studies, pursue a career in law, and become an attorney. Meanwhile, Jennifer's dream was to make it big in Hollywood as an actress. I was supportive of her aspirations, but I couldn't help but feel a tad anxious about how we'd make it work. I knew I'd be buried in law books while Jennifer jetted off for auditions all over the country. It's worth mentioning that I graduated a year ahead of her, even though she was 2 years older, and she remained a grade below me. I never quite figured out the reason behind this curious situation. Whenever I asked, she'd become defensive. Looking back, if I'd known the real truth, we might have called it quits right then and there. Trust me, you'll understand why later on. After high school, I headed off to an out-of-state law school, and that's when we entered the world of long-distance relationships. I know what you're thinking. Bad idea. But I was determined to make it work. We talked every night, and I visited her for holidays and special occasions. Sure, there were times when she couldn't chat for various reasons, but I didn't read too much into it. Then came the bombshell after her high school graduation. She wanted to study acting in Europe. Long distance within the same country was one thing, but an entire ocean between us? I couldn't help but worry, but she reassured me, promising countless phone calls and nightly chats. Time flew by, with her in Europe pursuing her acting dreams while I was back home, buried in law textbooks. I met plenty of interesting people, including some women, but I kept things strictly platonic. After all, I had law school exams to ace and a bar exam to prepare for. Fast forward a few years, I graduated from law school, passed the bar exam, and secured a job at a mid-sized law firm handling corporate contracts. Not the most exciting gig, but it paid the bills. Meanwhile, Jennifer had returned to the States, auditioning for roles left and right, though success was elusive. Eventually, we made it official and tied the knot, even though we'd been together for years. I steadily climbed the ranks at the law firm while she landed a few minor acting gigs. We swapped our tiny apartment for a house in Virginia. It was pricey, but with my stable job and good credit, we managed to secure a mortgage. Then it happened. The CEO of my firm got entangled in an embezzlement scandal, and the firm went under. Suddenly, my job vanished into thin air. We had accumulated some debt, and if we couldn't make our mortgage payments, we were on the fast track to losing our new home. When I broke the news to my wife, we shared a good cry and began brainstorming ways to stay financially afloat. We considered selling our belongings or her taking up a part-time job, perhaps even flipping burgers. Sadly, these ideas were like putting a small band-aid on a sinking ship. They wouldn't be nearly enough. As our mortgage deadline loomed closer, the pressure was building. Then, just a few days before we faced financial ruin, my wife dropped a bombshell. She had secured a major TV contract. She kept all the details under wraps, claiming it was top secret and wouldn't be disclosed to the public. It seemed a bit suspicious to me, but desperate times call for desperate measures, right? Time went by, and my wife gained more and more acting experience. Besides, we've all heard how TV shows go to great lengths to prevent spoilers. So, I didn't probe too much. Plus, her paychecks were sufficient to cover the mortgage. Life was back on track, and I was on cloud nine. I almost wished I could have stayed blissfully unaware, living that lie. However, our marriage was already starting to feel like yesterday's leftovers. 6 months passed by, and we were living without worries. No more nightmares about losing our home. I even landed a new job at a smaller law firm just 3 months later. They focused more on public advocacy than corporate work, and though the pay was lower, it felt satisfying to assist regular people. Meanwhile, my wife's acting career appeared to be skyrocketing. Her paycheck increased year after year, but she kept her cards close to her chest, revealing little about her work. Gradually, I began to grow suspicious. It didn't seem unreasonable to want some insight into what she was doing, especially when it was funding our mortgage. But I brushed off my concerns, convincing myself I was being paranoid, and chose to let it slide. After all, I had bigger issues to deal with at my new job and some personal growth goals. Speaking of personal development, I adopted a new diet and committed to hitting the gym 3 times a week. My wife, Jennifer, also made an effort. She would dress impeccably and apply makeup before going out. Strangely, we hardly shared intimate moments anymore, let alone went on dates, so her dressing up like a star was a bit puzzling. I mean, I understood that the TV industry had high standards, but little did I know about the real performance she was putting on. Looking back, you couldn't make this stuff up. The plot thickened when one day, an anonymous benefactor decided to spill the beans to me. I walked into my workplace to discover a plain white envelope in my desk drawer, bearing my name and the words, "Read right away." Inside were photographs of Jennifer in what looked suspiciously like a strip club, engaged in activities that left me dumbfounded. Initially, I brushed it off as a potential mistake, perhaps a cruel prank that I could laugh about later. The photos were not entirely clear and could be confused with someone else. I clung to the hope that it was all a misunderstanding or merely a joke. However, no one came forward to clarify the situation, and my concerns intensified. I realized I had to delve deeper into this matter. Having some money saved from previous pro bono work I had done before landing my current job, I made the decision to hire a private investigator. I didn't have the time or the stomach to lurk around strip clubs or engage in worse activities. Moreover, if my suspicions were baseless, I didn't want to subject my wife to unnecessary distress. While the private investigator's services weren't cheap, he proved to be diligent in his work. He traced the source of the photos and conducted a thorough investigation. The report arrived on my desk a day later, accompanied by high-resolution images that left no room for doubt. It was laid out plainly. My wife, Jennifer, my partner of 9 years, was playing a starring role at a high-end private couples club. My heart sank, and pressure built up in my throat, a pulsing sensation against my ribcage. The shock of my discovery hit me like a blast of ice-cold water. 9 years of marriage, plans to start a family once our mortgage was paid off, all now hung in the balance. I felt blindsided, betrayed by Jennifer after everything we had experienced and overcome together. I needed answers. So, that night, I sat in the living room, waiting for her return. It took a few hours, well into the dark of night, for her to walk through the door. I noticed her surprise at finding me awake, since I'd typically be sound asleep by the time she got back. In retrospect, I should have recognized it as a red flag, but they do say hindsight is 20/20. The damning evidence weighed heavily in my pocket, but I wanted to hear her side of the story first. I asked her directly, "Why were you working at a private couples club?" She appeared taken aback, saying, "Babe, you must be confused. I don't work at any such place. Where is this coming from? What's making you jump to such conclusions?" Despite the rush of anger, I managed to stay composed and pressed her to tell the truth. Jennifer continued to deny everything and looked at me as if I were insane. That's when I presented the pictures. I spread them out, one by one, watching her closely. With each glance she took, the colors seemed to drain from her face, and guilt oozed from her like heat from a furnace. Any lingering doubt I had about the photos belonging to her disappeared. However, instead of more lies or a defensive outburst, she broke down in tears. She claimed, "It was all for the mortgage, to save our home. It was for us. You must understand that I'm ashamed. Look at what I've become. I had to do this for us, but I couldn't tell you. I had to keep it hidden." But my betrayal radar was beeping louder than ever. I pointed out to her that her fear of disappointing me didn't give her the right to betray me. Her apology felt like a band-aid on a broken bone. She tried to justify that she never meant to hurt me and didn't want me to find out. Seriously? This excuse could never justify what she did. I then questioned her future plans. After all, I'd secured a new job a few months ago, and she could have quit then. We could have managed the mortgage without her nighttime escapades. She appeared at a loss for words, and frankly, I didn't need to hear anymore. Suddenly, everything began to click into place. The designer labels hanging on the coat racks, the expensive decor around our home, her $1,000 clothes. How could I have been so blind? The realization hit me like a punch in the gut. Jennifer was no longer the humble actress. She had become a highly paid symbol of sensuality. One last question lingered in the air. Did you enjoy it? The money, the fame, all of it. She remained silent, and the silence felt like an endless chasm to me. Finally, she asked, "What do you want me to do? Do you want me to quit?" At this point, I was fighting back tears. How could I trust her? We stood there in silence, like two statues in a crumbling monument of marriage, hoping for a miracle. My life felt like a cheesy joke. Then she broke the silence, pleading for a second chance and vowing to quit the next day. I wish I could have remained cold and kicked her out. I'm sorry to say this, but it's the truth. I should have refused. It would have been the right thing to do, and I came really close to doing it. But I couldn't bring myself to say the word divorce. It felt like I couldn't, given how intertwined our lives had become. Instead, I reluctantly agreed. I decided to give her a second chance. The following day, despite her objections, I went with her to the club to verify that she was truly quitting. There, I witnessed my wife confronting her boss. My fists clenched as I watched his smug expression. After this emotionally draining experience, we left the place together. I chose to take a week off from work to reconnect with my wife. We tried to relive our teenage days, reminiscing about the sweet nothings, the playful pranks, and the laughter. It felt nostalgic, and for a brief moment, I genuinely believed we could mend our relationship. It might sound strange, but my wife's former job at the private couples club had actually saved our house. It was a tough pill for me to swallow, given that I had always been the primary breadwinner. Nevertheless, she had quit right in front of me, and we now had more time to spend together. Another week passed, and she began applying for new jobs. Around the same time, my law firm assigned me to handle $1 million lawsuit in Indiana. The prospect of going long distance again made me anxious. However, my wife's reassurances gave me the courage to accept the job. At the airport, we bid each other a passionate farewell, filled with promises, hugs, and kisses. As I departed, a mix of excitement for my new role and anxiety about trusting Jennifer once more overwhelmed me. So there I was, trying to trust my wife to remain faithful while I was away or decide to end our marriage. I chose to trust her, even though some might judge me for it. Nevertheless, just when things were starting to improve, Murphy's Law struck once more. The universe seemed determined to test me further. My weakness had been exposed, indicating that I wasn't yet prepared to be strong, and my life took an unexpected turn as a result. The initial weeks at my new job showed promise. I was defending troubled teenagers on the verge of juvenile detention, which was the fulfilling work I had been searching for. Despite my busy schedule, I made it a point to call my wife every evening. However, after a few weeks, I noticed a change. There were times when she wasn't available or she didn't answer my calls. She had her explanations, like job hunting and errands, which I accepted without question. Then, one day at work, I received a mysterious text message. It was from the anonymous person who had originally alerted me to Jennifer's secret life. The message stirred up a familiar sense of unease, and my heart began to race once more. I promptly responded and arranged a meeting at a local restaurant for the following Tuesday. The week leading up to the meeting felt like an eternity, but Tuesday eventually arrived. I finished work by 5 p.m. and drove to the restaurant. I arrived a bit early, ordered the first thing I saw on the menu, and settled into my seat. To be honest, I wasn't really interested in the food. My entire focus was on the mysterious guest who was about to disrupt my life once again. Around 6 p.m., an elegant woman entered the restaurant. Somehow, I instinctively knew she was the person I had been expecting. As she approached my table, she introduced herself. "I'm Nancy, and you must be Jessica's husband, right?" "Yes," I replied. My interest sparked. "How did you come into possession of those pictures?" She let out a heavy sigh before responding. "We both worked at the same club, but I quit last week." She paused, scrutinizing me carefully before continuing. "I should have spoken up earlier, but I was afraid of losing my job. Now that I've left that terrible place, I believe it's time for you to hear the whole story." A whirlwind of emotions overtook me. Anxiety, anticipation, doubt. What was I about to discover about my wife? "Please continue," I urged, leaning forward with eagerness. Nancy exhaled and began. "Jessica and I were colleagues. We shared the same work schedule and often took our breaks together. I had been there for 3 years before she arrived. I helped her settle in, completely unaware that she was concealing her marital status. Whenever I asked her if this job was truly what she wanted, she always answered confidently with yes, and I took her at her word. At the outset, she would clock out promptly after her shift and head straight home. But over time, I noticed changes. She started spending more time with the customers and staff. Our club attracted many actors, and Jessica seemed to connect particularly well with them. She also began arriving at work in increasingly extravagant outfits. While this wasn't unusual for the job, Jessica was taking it to the next level. Nancy went on to recount how one night Jessica invited her to a nightclub after their shift. They both ended up quite intoxicated, though Nancy drank less as she had work the next morning. Taking responsibility for Jessica's condition, Nancy booked an Uber and decided to ensure she got home safely. On our way back, Jessica inquired about why I worked at the club. I shared the honest truth with her, the pressing need for money, and my unsuccessful attempts to secure employment elsewhere. When I posed the same question to her, she initially claimed it was to cover her mortgage. However, she later confessed that she continued working there because she enjoyed the luxurious lifestyle the job provided. Nancy then revealed a colossal bombshell, surpassing all the revelations before. In her intoxicated state, Jessica slipped up and mentioned that I sounded like her husband. I was horrified. I surmised that you must have been unaware, so I took those covert photos to alert you. Using social media, I identified your workplace, placed the envelope in your cubicle, and hoped for the best. I was left in shock, replaying the night when I had confronted my wife. You began for us but continued for yourself, I had accused her. My gut instincts had been correct, and I regretted not trusting them. I regretted acting weak and gullible throughout this ordeal. Noticing my silence, Nancy patiently waited for my response. I expressed gratitude for her candor and disclosed my decision to initiate divorce proceedings. With that, Nancy exited the restaurant and my life. Yet, something still felt unsettling. As I prepared to file for divorce, a startling letter arrived, adding yet another blow. The hits just kept coming. Jessica had beaten me to the punch, leveling allegations of misusage, mistreatment, and even infidelity against me. The outlandish claims were accompanied by a photo of Nancy and me at the restaurant. It suddenly dawned on me. Jessica had been monitoring my activities. Despite being overwhelmed by anger and anxiety, I recognized the need to maintain composure. Despite the damning evidence and my wife's public defamation on social media, I knew these accusations were unfounded. My first step was to rehire the same private investigator. Equipped with a wealth of evidence against my deceptive wife, I was prepared to mount a defense. Although Jessica had initiated the first strike against me, I was resolute in my determination to make her rue the day. I gathered all the information obtained by the private investigator and created backups on my phone and computer. Subsequently, I reached out to Nancy, inquiring if she would be willing to testify on my behalf during the divorce hearing. My wife had taken a screenshot of our conversation and was accusing me of infidelity and more. Nancy's response came after a full day. Yes, just let me know when. I replied, informing her that the hearing was scheduled for the following month. I spent the night meticulously organizing all the evidence and mentally preparing myself for the ultimate showdown, putting an end to my wife's duplicitous games. Fast forward 1 month, the day of the divorce hearing finally arrived. I picked up Nancy, and together we drove to the courthouse in Virginia. I had her take an early seat in the courtroom, intending to keep my wife unaware of Nancy's presence until it was her turn to testify. After all, if my wife could ambush me with more falsehoods, I felt justified in surprising her with the unvarnished truth. I also met with my attorney, who arrived 15 minutes after Nancy and me. My wife made her grand entrance 45 minutes later, accompanied by her extended family, a well-dressed man I assumed was her attorney, and a young girl who bore a striking resemblance to my wife. A few minutes later, the judge entered and the hearing commenced. The opening statement by my wife's attorney left me in shock. He accused me of the very infidelity I had accused my wife of. He asserted that I had forced her to resign from her job, refused to assist her in finding new employment, and falsely accused her when I secured a better-paying job. To make matters worse, he argued that I intended to deny her alimony, leaving her destitute. The most startling allegation followed soon after. It was something I couldn't have concocted even in my wildest dreams. Allegedly, I was neglecting to provide any support for our supposed daughter who required financial assistance. He asked the court to compel me to make alimony payments to my wife after the divorce. I was utterly flabbergasted. My wife had never mentioned having a daughter, and her family had kept mum about it as well. We hadn't even planned on having children, let alone an 11 or 12-year-old girl. As I tried to wrap my head around these revelations, I recalled a peculiar reaction my wife had had to a question in high school. It then struck me. She must have dropped out to conceal a pregnancy. All these years I believed we had no secrets, yet she had concealed this colossal one right in front of me. I had no time to dwell on this shocking revelation, however. The divorce hearing was already in progress, and I had to face it head-on. This revelation hit me hard, but I couldn't afford to be sentimental or weak anymore. I had to fight for my life at this moment. So it was our turn, and the battle began. My attorney cleared his throat before addressing the judge, saying, "Your Honor, they've misrepresented my client at every turn. There isn't a single instance of infidelity on his part that can be substantiated. The photographs and questions presented lack sufficient evidence to support such a claim. Moreover, we possess solid evidence that it's the opposing party who has been involved in rampant infidelity. Please refer to Exhibits A, B, and C, which show the opposing party openly admitting to deceptive conduct for financial gain. These actions do not reflect the character of a trustworthy individual, especially one who distorts our actions and those of my client. Additionally, we contest the assertion that the opposing party requires financial support. As Exhibit D demonstrates, she is currently employed and entirely capable of sustaining herself. Any contradictory claims are misleading. If opposing counsel disagrees, we challenge them to provide bank records to substantiate their case." My attorney took a pause before wrapping up, stating, "My client has been deceived and misled, and now he seeks to extricate himself from this web of falsehoods without suffering financial losses. We believe the court will see this as a reasonable request." The judge took a moment to deliberate, then proceeded to examine the evidence. The final exhibit, Exhibit D, had been meticulously gathered by my private investigator. It provided undeniable proof that my wife was still gainfully employed, and as the courtroom viewed the evidence, her face visibly lost color. The photographs clearly depicted her working at a private couples club just a week prior, adorned in luxurious clothing and jewelry. Her attorney seemed bewildered while her family appeared astonished. I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph as her elaborate scheme unraveled before everyone's eyes. Throughout this entire ordeal, I had borne the brunt of the blows, and they just kept coming. Granted, I shared the responsibility when I granted her a second chance and chose the path of weakness, but now I had no remorse, and it was my turn to counterattack. Then came the ultimate bombshell when my attorney summoned Nancy to the witness stand. As Nancy stood up, my wife turned even paler, and I couldn't contain my satisfaction. Under my attorney's questioning, Nancy verified her identity, acknowledged her previous employment at the same club as Jennifer, my dear wife, and shared her observations about her. Nancy revealed how Jennifer flaunted her wealth and confessed to deceiving her husband while inebriated. When my attorney questioned Nancy about a photograph featuring both her and me, she clarified that she had approached me to disclose Jennifer's infidelity and had no reason to be afraid since she had resigned from her job at the club. She emphasized that the photograph didn't serve as evidence of any wrongdoing on my part, and to solidify this, she provided an audio recording of our conversation. As the recording played, my wife's expression soured further. She must have assumed I hadn't recorded anything, and without it, I might have fallen victim to her deception. However, the unfiltered truth was now exposed for everyone to hear, leaving her with no defense. After the recording was submitted as evidence, the judge turned to my wife and her attorney with a stern demeanor. Both parties have presented their cases and arguments concerning alimony. If there are any additional statements you wish to make, Please do so before I deliver my verdict. I anticipated an emotional outburst from my wife, but she remained silent, her face buried in her hands. Even her family and her attorney regarded her with disappointment and disdain. The courtroom descended into silence before the judge addressed us once more. In regards to alimony, I find that the plaintiff lacks valid grounds to request financial support. The divorce petition is approved. And just like that, I was officially divorced and a free man. I walked out of that courtroom, grinning like a kid who had just swiped the last piece of candy from the store. I never spoke to or saw Jennifer again. The moment had a bittersweet quality. Well, who am I kidding? It was mostly sweet. The only bitter aspect was the realization of how much time I had invested in a person like her. And as for my private investigator, he was my savior. He unearthed me from an avalanche of lies and deception, safeguarding more than just my finances. If there were a Nobel Prize for rescuing unsuspecting husbands, he'd be the recipient. This one's for him. Thank you for listening. I decided to surprise her by showing up at her house in the evening. It was sunset, so the house was quite dark when I entered through the garage. As I walked in, most of the lights were off, but I noticed a faint glow coming from the cracks around her bedroom door down the hall. As I approached, I could hear what was happening inside. Curiosity got the better of me, and I discreetly peeked through the door crack, only to witness her engaging in a sexual act with another guy. My blood started to boil, but I remembered the anger issues I had struggled with in the past and how I had learned to control myself, channeling my anger in healthier ways. So, I managed to steady my heart rate and silently walked away from the door without making a sound. They remained oblivious to my presence. I entered the living room and began pacing, filled with thoughts like, why is she doing this? And how long has she been lying to me? Then it struck me that I would wait until they were in the middle of their sexual encounter and then break it off with her. I knew her sexual routine was somewhat predictable, so I expected it would be a while before they got to that point. With that in mind, I headed to the kitchen, which was on the opposite side of the house, ensuring they wouldn't hear any noise I made unless I deliberately wanted them to. After the rush of adrenaline, anger, and thoughts swirling in my head, my stomach started to growl. I hadn't eaten because I had planned to have dinner and watch a movie with her. I glanced into the fridge, but the thought of food made me feel queasy. Old habits, however, die hard, so I checked the pantry. Spotting a box of popcorn, I thought, why not? Popcorn seemed like a stomach-settling option with its buttery, salty goodness. I grabbed a bag, placed it in the microwave, and fortunately, she had one of those newer, quieter models. The only loud part was the latch on the door, so I carefully opened it to avoid making a noise. I cooked the popcorn, shook the bag, added some white cheddar seasoning, and shook it some more. Finally, I poured it into a bowl and continued to shake it a bit. I paused for a moment to listen for any sounds coming from her room, and sure enough, they hadn't stopped their activities, so they remained oblivious to my presence. About a minute later, I walked into the living room, grabbed a few bites of popcorn, and then I heard the awaited sound of the bed squeaking, indicating a shift in weight toward the center of the bed. It was clear someone was riding the other person, and then it hit me. Perfect, I thought. I know what to do. I mentioned earlier that her sexual routine was quite predictable. Well, I knew her physical cues well enough to time her noise. She wasn't exactly a screamer, but she could get loud. She also had insecurities, so she preferred to keep the lights off. When I glanced down the hall, I confirmed there was no light seeping through the bottom of the bedroom door, so I began timing it. I listened to the rhythm of her moans and the squeaks of the bed. I aimed to open the door in the middle of one of her moans so they wouldn't hear the latch. Peering in, I saw she was riding him vigorously, facing the headboard, which meant her back was to the door. I carefully backed out, checked the hall to see that the lights were still off, and then I opened the door once more, timed to coincide with one of her moans. I stepped inside quietly, with her obstructing his line of sight to the door. I settled into a desk chair she had near the door and started munching on my popcorn. It took a minute for the aroma of the popcorn to fill the room. She stopped, turned on the nightstand light, and faced me. They saw me sitting there, one foot crossed over my knee, bowl of popcorn in hand, nodding my head. I said, "Don't stop because of me. I'm just here to see if she'll do anything different for you that she wasn't going to do for me." I said, "Don't stop because of me. I'm just here to see if she'll do anything different for you that she wasn't going to do for me." I took a few more bites of popcorn, watching the guy's eyes widen with each passing moment. Her face turned red with shame. Then, after finishing a bite of popcorn, I added, "Looks like she's doing the same thing she did to me last night. Quite entertaining from this angle." I got up, left the bowl of popcorn in the chair, closed the bedroom door, gathered the few things of mine I had left at her place, and walked out. As I was getting my car into gear, he rushed out and started demanding to know who I was. I replied, "Well, I was her boyfriend. Apparently, I didn't get the memo this evening that it was over." He began shaking like a frightened dog and said, "I didn't know she had a boyfriend." "Yeah, it seems she's not honest about things," I remarked, while covering my mouth as if to hide a sore. I drove off. A few hours later, she sent me texts, ranging from apologies to blaming me, then apologizing again, claiming it was a mistake and that the other guy meant nothing. She later shifted the blame back to me, saying, "It wouldn't have happened if I hadn't expected to see you tonight." After that, I blocked her number. Moving on from the chaos that was Jennifer, I focused on rebuilding my life. I threw myself into my work at the law firm, finding solace in helping troubled teenagers navigate the justice system. The rewarding nature of my job helped distract me from the emotional turmoil I had experienced. Weeks turned into months, and I found myself enjoying the single life again. I spent more time with friends, picked up new hobbies, and even started dating casually. It wasn't long before I met someone who made me realize that love could be simple and drama-free. Her name was Sarah, and we met at a charity event my law firm was sponsoring. She was a graphic designer with a kind heart and a great sense of humor. We hit it off immediately, bonding over our shared interests and similar outlooks on life. Our relationship grew steadily, built on mutual trust and respect, qualities that had been sorely lacking in my previous marriage. One day, Sarah and I were walking through a park, enjoying the warm weather and each other's company. As we strolled hand in hand, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in a long time. She turned to me and asked, "Do you ever think about your past relationship?" I paused, considering her question. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but more as a lesson than a regret. It taught me a lot about what I don't want in a relationship and what I'm truly looking for." Sarah smiled, giving my hand a reassuring squeeze. "I'm glad you learned from it, and I'm happy we found each other." As we continued our walk, I realized how far I'd come since that fateful day when I discovered Jennifer's betrayal. I had rebuilt my life again and emerged stronger and wiser from the experience. It wasn't an easy journey, but it led me to a place of genuine happiness and contentment. From then on, I knew that no matter what challenges life threw at me, I had the strength and resilience to overcome them. And with Sarah by my side, I felt ready to face whatever the future held, confident that we could handle anything together.